Welcome to our webinar titled The Current State of Sexual and Reproductive Health Rights, focusing on the global impact of U.S. foreign policy. We have with us three esteemed panelists that are going to take us through the discussion on today's topic, and we encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A box as the discussion goes along so that we actively engage with the comments that you are sharing. I'll start by introducing our wonderful guest today. First is Dr. Tlaleng Mofokeng, affectionately known as Dr. T. Dr. T is a globally renowned and awarded doctor and human rights defender. She is a best-selling author of Dr. T, A Guide to Sexual Health and Pleasure. She is the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Health, and she's also the co-chair of the Lancet O'Neill Commission on Racism, Structural Discrimination, and Global Health. Dr. T leads the Center for Global Policy and Politics on the Women's Health Portfolio. She's a medical director at DISA Clinic, a women's health clinic in Johannesburg, and has expertise in various fields of SRHR, including the access to safe and legal abortion, comprehensive sexuality education, and sex work decriminalization. So we welcome Dr. T to our panel. Next on our panel, we have Letlogonolo Mogoroane. Mogoroane is a practicing barrister in South Africa and member of the Johannesburg Society of Advocates. They are head of strategic litigation and research at Our Equity NPC. They are also part-time in-house counsel at the Center for Applied Legal Studies at the University of Witwatersrand. They have written submissions to the United Nations and the South African National Assembly on matters related to the rights of queer people in areas such as legal identification, marriage, and also addressing issues of hate speech and discrimination. Their current work includes a focus on access to gender-affirming care for prisoners, the rights of sex workers, the rights of trans people, and more generally, the right to health. Welcome, Letlogonolo Mogoroane. I hope I didn't butcher your name there. You can correct it when you come online. And last but not least, certainly, we have Dr. Satang Nabane. Dr. Nabane is an award-winning interdisciplinary scholar, social justice advocate, educator, and human rights practitioner. Her public engagements and scholarship have been featured in various top-tier academic journals, and she has also been featured in media outlets such as the New York Times, Reuters, and Time. Dr. Nabane has been named one of 10 exceptionally talented African scholars to watch in 2024 by the Africa Report. She works at the intersection of gender, law, and democracy across Africa and is known for her work on women and children's rights. She's a highly respected human rights and women's rights advocate in the Gambia and has been instrumental in passing two key legislative acts, particularly the Women's Rights Act and the Children's Act. Welcome to Dr. Nabane. And now to begin our session, I will hand over to Dr. T to give us some opening remarks to help to frame the current dispensation that we are in, where the US has reinstated the global gag rule and has joined the Geneva Consensus Declaration, which seeks really to push for the notion that the right to abortion is not a right to health issue. Over to you, Dr. T, for our opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for the introduction, and good day to all of the fellow panelists and everyone who's joining us for this webinar. I am honored to be able to participate in my capacity as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Right to Health, and of course in my role leading the Global Health Hub and women's rights work at the Center for Global Policy and Politics, and of course to kickstart this sexual and reproductive justice webinar series, which will take us through every month from March to June 2025. For millions of people throughout the world, the full enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health remains a distant goal. And in many cases, this goal is even becoming harder to reach for many people who are marginalized, discriminated, made vulnerable, or criminalized. And as a practicing medical doctor with a focus on sexual and reproductive health, I view the practice of medicine in itself as a way of defending the human rights of those affected by structural inequalities and those experiencing intersectional and multiple forms of discrimination due to either their age, disability, gender expression, gender identity, sexual orientation, occupation such as sex work, and socioeconomic status or health status that leads to exclusion. Sexual and reproductive health are integral elements of the right to health, and yet many obstacles stand in the way. And these obstacles are interrelated, are entrenched, and they operate at different levels in clinical care, at the level of health systems, at the underlying determinants of health. And what we will probably most likely end up discussing a lot of today are the political determinants of health. And some of these obstacles have their roots in patriarchy and colonialism and neocolonialism, and how they relate to structural and systemic inequalities, resulting in differential access to the enjoyment of the underlying and social determinants of health. And this is true between and within countries. And this is why these are human rights issues, is that differential outcomes that are resultant because of these particular structures. And we know that patriarchal oppression is universal. It permeates all of society, and it's at the very origin of the erosion of autonomy. Patriarchal oppression, which I often call patriarchal violence, seeks to control the girls' and women's bodies and other people who present very differently in the world, who may very well have sexual orientation or gender identity that does not conform. And this control or the erosion of these people's autonomy is detrimental to their own enjoyment of sexual and reproductive rights. And we know an example, of course, is restriction on abortion and abortion care and post-abortion care. And politically speaking, I think it's important to locate this particular conversation within the history, but also the current impact of colonialism that has enabled the patriarchal control of sexuality and the expression of gender diverse people, and how that particular discrimination continues through the laws and the policies, but also practices. I've come to realize, and as many of us on this call know, that it's not enough to just look at laws or policies in black and white. A lot of practice happens. A lot of what gives medicine its character, its practices that are not necessarily in black and white. And so we ought to look very intently at those particular practices as well, because they present a direct legacy of former colonial regimes and how they also use criminalization, discrimination, stigmatization, among other things. And our learned friends on this call work on issues of identity, consensual adult same sex, marital rights, and the like. And so when we frame this conversation around global health aid, and multilateral donors, it's important to interrogate to what extent does that donor, that support, that aid perpetuate these very harmful power dynamics that enable patriarchal violence to take place. And as a form of neocolonialism, I often argue that donor funding without the necessary safeguards actually just perpetuates the differential outcomes in health and actually do more harm than good. In previous reports that I've written, I often talk about the need for global solidarity, and that in fact it is important to support many countries, especially those who are low income in terms of health spending and budgeting. But there has to be transparency and accountability, but there has to also be a level of respect. Once you give people support and aid, you ought to let them determine where that aid is good for and what it needs to do. And at the same time, we have to have systems in place in the national context where we can depend less and less and less on donor funding and donor aid. But this is the actual framework of global health. And for us to depend less and less on donor aid, we would have to have less and less of how global health is currently structured. And that's a question that we ought to ask. are people themselves working in global health willing to talk about and to interrogate the power dynamics that come with the reliance of donor funding for such crucial services as sexual and reproductive health rights? There's often a call to decolonize aid. What does that even look like? Where do we even start, right? When we know that in many instances, we are held back by maladministration and corruption in the health sector, both in high and low income countries and middle income countries. And so the over reliance and the high dependence on the political agendas, the neo-colonialist trends, mean that the funds come with substantial conditions. And we find ourselves now where we are grappling with the expanded global gag rule. But back in 2016, during Trump's first term in office, and even in his electioneering, he already hinted that he is going to see an administration that blocks US aid to foreign entities that provided abortion services. And he expanded those conditions beyond what was already a very chilling impact of the global gag. And in South Africa, for example, that conditional grant was at odds with our own country context and our own legal framework that not only decriminalized abortion, but made it legal. But you had so many non-governmental organizations supplementing the work of government who did take that money with those conditions and therefore further making the services, information, access to goods, and facilities for abortion even harder to reach. So, with so much money on the line for so many other critical services, the question is, are we surprised that many governments led by men who are themselves patriarchal, who are themselves anti-choice, are actually okay with these expansions? I've been writing about this for more than a decade, even as a young medical doctor. It can't be that with this second reiteration of a Trump administration, we are now shocked and horrified at the very thing that he said he would do during his electioneering. What did we do in the interim to ensure that we put our own countries, our own regions on a sustainable path of domestic funding? I know for a fact, and I've heard of different impacts, but I, many years ago, already in 2017, 2018, was approached to edit a book and make updates. And that book was designed to give information to young women on sexual and reproductive health with a focus on HIV prevention. And I added a chapter on that book called Pregnant Now What? And all I did with that chapter was reference the Constitution of South Africa and the Choice on Termination of Pregnancy Act of South Africa, and then say to people, if you think you are pregnant, you do have options. Please seek care and get information. And as soon as Trump then was elected, even before the inauguration, all of those booklets were burnt. So when you look at that kind of response and you look at the issues going on around banning of books, if you look at the other issues around banning of critical race theory, for example, it goes on and on and on and on. And it can't be looked at anything else except neo-colonial violence. And so fast forward to today. As a country, South Africa is no stranger. Many countries around the world are no stranger to having, foreign aid, but also having conditions dictated to them as recipients of that money. It is important to understand that the solutions have always started at home. The solutions and the strategies and the advocacy has always been local. And as we think global about impact, how do we think about local NGOs bringing together responsible global partners to support and to strategize and move forward. I, on the one hand, maybe glass half empty, sometimes half full, only because of how exhausting this has been to be saying as a warning, this is impeding. We have an impending crisis that's going to happen. And because it only affected people who needed abortions and sex workers, because even at the time, you couldn't participate in any legal reform or advocacy around sex work decriminalization, it was deemed, oh, well, charge it to the game, right? We can still do so much. But now that it's affecting everyone across the board, there is this call to immediately act, and it's valid and we must act. But I think we need to recognize that many of us have been shouting and saying this isn't okay, right? And we ourselves were being let down by our own colleagues, our own comrades in the movement because we are abortion providers or because people that we support were sex workers. So there's a level of honesty as well that needs to be had when we are having these conversations about how to move forward, right? And so I'm excited today to hear about the different ways in which we can think about aid. We can decolonize aid. Is that possible within this context of a racist, imperialist world? And so how do we then hold those governments accountable? How do we have allies in different countries who are going to demand accountability for their own governments because this is part of foreign policy, right? So you have foreign policy that's colliding with human rights, that's in collision with the right to health, that's causing detrimental implications across the world. And therefore, how do we then hold our own elected leaders accountable in the countries in which we all operate? And so if we are ever to attain any of the sustainable development goals, we are already out of time for all of them in any case. But as a framework, as a vision that brings all of us together, we can't continue on a trajectory that result in obstructed access to sexual and reproductive health care, or delayed care, or unsafe procedures, or complications resulting in mortalities and mortality. Abortion care is still one of the safest medical procedures, period. And yet we know the kinds of delays and complications that can happen that are being manufactured. And so this panel discussion is really exciting. And I'm going to hand this over to you, Sarah, as our moderator. And I just want to say that an intersectional feminist, but also human rights-based approach must be urgently adopted to ensure that all of our successes and efforts yield the desired results timelessly in order to advance sexual and reproductive health rights. And that my mandate as the UN Special Rapporteur continues to intervene in various ways on this particular matter, from the Roe v. Wade case where we submitted an amicus, and many different other ways as well. And next week I'll be in Washington, D.C. on various other programs as well on this very matter. And so I look forward to also learning from the fellow panelists, and also thank you for everyone for joining us for this important series. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. T, for those really strong opening remarks. You know, we must depend less and less on donor aid. And are we ready to confront the power structure so that we ensure that the right to health is protected regardless of which regimes come in and out of power? And so now I want to hand it over to Letlohonolo to talk a little bit about broadly what is the impact of the global gag rule on trans people, on access to right to health as it is defined and important for trans people. And what do you think are some of the challenges we have to contend with in this moment?
Good afternoon, good evening, good morning to everyone. Really wonderful to be here. Sarah, you didn't butcher my name on the second try, so I'm really glad for that. You were a bit nervous, but you eventually got there, which is good. I mean, Dr. T spoke about what the global gag rule is, right? But we know that it's a US-based policy that prohibits organizations outside of the US from receiving US funding for providing information, offering safe abortion services, or advocating for safe abortion. But what's been really interesting about the Trump administration is this idea of Project 2025, right? Which is this detailed roadmap that has been developed by influential ultra-conservative US groups outlining their policy agendas and also servicing as a blueprint for, what we now know as the second Trump presidency. And this plan included specific policy recommendation to implement an ultra-conservative agenda, including restrictions to access to sexual and reproductive health services, particularly abortion in the US and worldwide. Now, for many of us, we'll be like, but I don't live in the US, so why do I care about this, right? But what we know for certain is that the US is the largest contributor to global health funding. And restricted policies like the global gag rule and conservatives' agendas like Project 25 create a rippling effect around the world. We know, for instance, in South Africa, an institution called WITS IHR, which was an institution that provided hormone replacement therapy for trans people, had to shut down immediately when Trump implemented the broader global gag, so to speak, right? A number of clinics called in Men Engage, which gave pre-exposure prophylaxis, had to close down. And so many other facilities that helped trans people access either hormonal therapy or some form of antiretroviruses, antiretroviral virus pills, had to shut down. So the developments have limited the scope of sexual and reproductive health care available to millions, right? Particularly in low-income countries that rely heavily, unfortunately, on US donor programs for maternal health, for contraceptives, for HIV treatment and prevention. So it has devastating impact. It means that effectively you went from being able to go to a clinic to get your hormones monthly to potentially not knowing where you're going to get it because the funding has just been halted. And we're not sure what's going to happen because, again, US is the largest contributor of global health funding. We've seen what the presidency has done in relation to the World Health Organization. And so there's a lot of things that, unfortunately, we often say the US sneezes and we all feel the impact, right? And this is where one of it happens, where we're all feeling the impact of the global gag rule, particularly for us as trans and non-binary and gender diverse persons, and also people who want to access abortion, because you think about trans people and gender non-conforming people who access abortion, sometimes it's as a result of violence, and they may not be able to access these abortion services because of the global gag rule.
Thank you so much for those remarks, Little Honolo. And I want to turn it over now to Satang to talk a little bit about, Little Honolo mentioned this immediate impact where suddenly clinics were shut down, suddenly, medication was not being dispersed. What have you been seeing as the impact in Africa, and sort of what is your assessment of the challenges that are ahead?
Sure. Thanks, Sarah, and good to be here with all of you folks attending, but also with friends as well. I mean, it's always good to be in a space like this with friends, particularly during these unprecedented times. But maybe, as Dr. T said, it's not unprecedented per se. We've been here before. This is just another iteration of it. But I do think at the crux of it is really that we're also navigating a period where the basic tenets of what it means to be human, right, is actually being argued, right, and contested. And I think it speaks to the broader context of, Dr. T's earlier observation that this is not just about the work stop orders or the withdrawal or the hold on foreign assistance, right? I think it goes beyond that, including, for example, as you said rightly, with regard to the Geneva Consensus Declaration and how especially that there is a constant attempt to censor progressive concepts and language around SRHR, right? Which seems very abstract, but I think when you really look at it at the domestic level or at the national level, obviously it impacts the sort of programming and legislative work and national reform that's ongoing as well. Similar to what has already been highlighted, I think is also recognizing that civil society organizations, as correctly highlighted, who have worked tirelessly over decades, really building long-term partnerships and relationships with affected communities, right, whose work are vital, has stopped, right, immediately, right, given sort of the USAID stuff, but also broader context on foreign assistance, but particularly with the global gag rule, as highlighted as well. I think when you look at it, especially if you're thinking about abortion, I mean, the African context obviously continues to have the highest levels or the highest numbers of abortion-related deaths, right? And so we know that quite a lot of organizations that are within African context, whether that's Kenya, whether that's Ghana, I mean, you could choose any country, right? Programs are actually going to be heavily impacted, but also, as already highlighted, life-saving initiatives and programs as well, given the sort of stop work orders as well. I also wanted to highlight, I think, one of the other things that we need to acknowledge as well is that this time around, it's not just the funding thing, right? But there is an intentional attack on science and evidence, right? And I think that's one of the biggest thing that we're seeing in terms of that we probably are in an era of declining trust in science. Obviously, we've seen the attempt by the current Trump administration, withdrawal from WHO, which including obviously impact on SRHR evidence generation, but we've also seen precedent setting as well that other governments have shown their intention as well to withdraw, and we know that at least the funding gap is more than 800 million going forward, right, in relation to that. But I think most especially as well is really thinking about the idea around evidence-based policy making, which is being attacked and weaponized, obviously, by actors as well. And I mean, for a researcher myself, a practitioner who is from the African continent but lives in the US, in the Midwest, is interesting times, I think, both in relation to not just the attack, as I said, on evidence, but also the fact that, especially as we know it, robust evidence hubs, we know that websites are being scrubbed of data and evidence that have been generated over decades, right? That especially researchers and practitioners and actors on the ground usually use, especially when thinking about longitudinal data access and sharing of evidence around this, means that we are invariably living obviously an evidence vacuum, right? Where facilitated whether by social media or the political movements that we've seen, mis and disinformation will obviously flourish, right? And I'm sure that this is a conversation that we're going to have as well. But I also wanted to highlight, given my sort of positionality within the US context, right, that the idea around DEI, right, we might see it, especially from the African context, as maybe not important, right? But I do think that diversity, equity, and inclusion obviously is integral to achieving SRHR for all, right? And so it is a direct attack also on the advancement of SRHR, which I think should be part of the broader conversation as well. But yeah, and I'm gonna stop here, but I'm sure that we are gonna talk about most of these things going forward as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Satang. And I kind of want to come back to you, Dr. T, as we switch gears. We know, as Little Honolo has said, as Satang has said, there's a very coordinated approach and attack, right? Which includes misinformation, which includes removal of information, and which also includes an infusion of, I would say, religious and moral ideology as a basis for pushing forward this anti-rights sort of movement, rhetoric, and policy. How do we respond? How do activists respond to this?
So there is a way in which whiteness, right, and white supremacy sees itself as the way of being. And everything else that is outside of that definition, they see it and they feel it as a direct attack on them and their personhood, right? So if you think about the ways in which we sit and think about advocacy, about, racial justice and gender justice and even reproductive justice, we understand those as issues of rights, of autonomy, that are beneficial to entire populations of people, and that without them, we will literally not survive. But whiteness uses, and it creates, and white supremacy, it creates and catastrophize everyday things, right? Or there's a black person coming around the corner, and then suddenly you get profiled, and now you get killed because, well, you were some danger to me, and I thought my life was in danger, right? So there's a political level, that all these things are tools to actually further white supremacy. Because if you look at the way they're coming after sexual orientation and gender identity, if you look at the way that they are hinting at same-sex marriage, at civil rights, none of those things have to do with abortion per se, but they have to do with self-determination and autonomy. And that is the problem, right? Is that how dare all of these groups of people think they can determine and be autonomous outside of what we frame as a way of being through life. And that's why they fight back. For them is so personal as well. But that's why they have to use things like these nationalist patriotic rhetoric, because then you are a traitor to the flag or to the country, right? If you actually then advocate and demand your rights. That's why many people may know very well that what's happening is wrong, but they can't say anything, they won't say anything, lest they be termed a traitor. And therefore their benefits to being proximal to whiteness or to white supremacy gets taken away. And so it's about understanding that the misinformation is beyond just a superficial matter of, well, someone just doesn't like abortions and so they're giving in the wrong information. This is like it's deep, and it's like a sustained, well-funded attack on the vision of a just and fair world. And it would look different in the economic sector. It would look different in global health. And we're discussing the global health perspective. And so how we think about structural discrimination, how we think about racism, how we think about all of the isms have to permeate through all of society. You know, I always say to people, if you want to know how to support any cause and you are an accountant, every day you must ask yourself, in my accounting formulas and in my accounting ways, how am I entrenching white supremacy? If you are, you know, Tlhogonono was in court the whole day. If you are in court all day, how are your briefs and your arguments entrenching the very thing that we are trying to end here today, right? So it's everyone's job everywhere to realize that in fact this stuff is deep violations of human rights. Because remember, the right to information enables informed consent, enables you to seek help and health better. It allows you to also be a partner in your own medical journey with your doctor or your nurse or whoever your healthcare provider is. And sexual and reproductive health information is particularly key when you think about things like forced pregnancies, when you think about delayed or denied abortions, when you think about coercion, and you think about marital rape. So it's not just misinformation, and so people must just find the right information. These are human rights issues, and those are violations of human rights. Because without information, you are already stripping people away their dignity. And so our fight forward and past all of this is to be consistent, And I have a big, issue all the time with some of the grant makers and funders who always say, but what's the impact? What's the impact? But what is the impact of people knowing their rights and having information. I don't know, maybe in 5 years, that's when they'll need that information. Maybe it's in 2 years, but is the matrix of us even measuring what impact is even even relevant, even fair, you know? So there is a conversation also to be had about how do we create sustained movements that can, because we exist, but we are not as well funded, we are not as resourced as those people who are doing misinformation, right? So yeah, I think for me it's about sustainability, sustained action, and working sort of all of society perspective. And that's how we get to build allies and to build people who can support, who can be our voices where we in some rooms we can't literally be in. But if we can have more and more people understand and support the vision of justice ultimately, I think we will be successful. But we need to understand these as human rights violation. And so supporting the movement, supporting grassroots movements, supporting women-led movements, supporting queer-led movements is part of reparative justice, is part of doing the work of human rights.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. T. And just moving to you, Satang, where is your space in this movement, right? We've heard it's a whole society approach, so it's not just a one-man show or even a one section of society show. It's everybody. So where are you and what have you seen that are good strategies and lessons or ways forward from the community you would say that you come from as a member of this larger, broader movement?
What community do I come from? Many. But I do think I've been obviously within the African context, there is a whole lot of conversation in terms of the lessons perhaps that we draw from surviving earlier versions of whatever this is, right? And I mean, and to Dr. T's point, I think really going to and focusing on this idea of moving away, obviously, from the siloed ways that we did things, right? As she highlighted in her opening, and I think this is something to reiterate as well, right? That even within the women rights movement, obviously you have folks that do not want to work on, decriminalizing sex work, for instance, or working on LGBTIQ plus issues, right? And I do think part of the research that I have been part of, really trying to map out, for example, the strategies and the actions and the practices of anti-rights conservative movements that are based in the global north, particularly in the US, and their connections with conservative actors within the African region, including in South Africa, including Kenya, including Ghana, and how we've seen a transplant of not just ideas, right, but even strategies, especially litigation strategies, right? I mean, the fetal burial case that we had in South Africa is a good example of how some of the arguments, the legal arguments that we see within the U.S. context have actually been replicated within the African context as well, but also even in terms of flyers and fact sheets that have been replicated, right? And I do think there's a conversation here to also have on the other side, which I have been part of, right, in terms of what can the U.S. learn from the rest of us, right? Whether that's the African context or the Latin American context, which have had incredible social movements, but also very progressive jurisprudence as well. And I mean, I have an edited book chapter that's coming out on this, especially just highlighting the way, especially as we think about abortion and abortion rights within the African context, and particularly the rollback on Roe through the Dobbs decision, I think is really also banking on even the jurisprudential resources that we have within the African context, right? I mean, it was already mentioned, for example, the South African context, but I think one of the lessons learned is that this is a long fight, right? I mean, obviously, my research agenda is very much focused on South Africa, even though we do have the South Africans here. I'm saying a lot about South Africa, but I think one of the lessons that we can learn is that South Africa is a stark reminder that securing, for example, legal abortion is not the end of the struggle, right? I mean, part of the work I've done is on conscientious objection, but also on other areas as well. And as I already highlighted, what the US can really learn from the South African context, right, is despite the fact that you can have very progressive legislation, as already highlighted, is that there is need for constant advocacy as well as defense, right? But I also think, and I mean, we also have other lawyers here, I mean, even the framing around abortion, right? I mean, despite the fact that we have the highest number of unsafe abortion and abortion-related death within the African region, I think one of the really good things that we've been very successful at, I think, is even how we frame abortion, right? Abortion that is not really about just medical issue, right? That it is, as Dr. C said, a human rights issue, a right to health issue that the US should and can learn from. We know that, for example, with the way that Roe was framed, it was a woman-centered constitutional right to privacy that obviously overrode state criminalization and inspired abortion law reform in the US, but also beyond as well. But what we've really seen, both at the domestic level within African context, but also even regionally with the Maputo Protocol, right, is how abortion, as I said, is really, there's an attempt to conceive abortion as a reproductive right that within obviously the right to health, but also that is then requires states to ensure that that services are available, acceptable, and of good quality. But beyond that as well, we've seen progressive jurisprudence as well, both at the international and the regional level. So I do think part of really, especially in the circles that I'm currently in from the US side, is really for US social movements and those that are engaged in the work to ensure reproductive rights for all, is really thinking about the framing that is really centered around reproductive rights, abortion as a human rights issue, but also as a gender equality issue as well. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And Letlogonolo, we're talking about this as more of a human rights argument. As someone who's an expert in the area of trans rights and gender affirming care, I do think trans health has sort of, to Dr. T's point and Satang's point, things have been siloed a little bit and it hasn't been a whole human rights or a whole right to health movement. So what really do you think is the way going forward in securing everybody's health rights, everybody's SRHR rights?
I mean, I want to say we burn everything and we start again, because I think that's the only way we secure everyone's rights. As James Baldwin wrote to Alice Walker, to Angela Davis, he said, if they come for you in the evening, they'll be sure to come for us in the morning, right? So that's where we are, right? They're coming for one sect, but we're seeing the ripple effect that is happening in so many things. But I do think that the kind of opportunities we have in some instances is to ensure that there's effective containment of anti-rights opposition to attacks on SAHR. I think that we really need to begin to support adopting progressive national policies and also international policies, UN resolutions that counter misinformation on a range of SRHR issues. And how we do this is we have to analyze the anti-rights messaging and identify an effective and data messaging to counter the misinformation. So we don't go in blind, right? Satang was speaking a lot about data and I thought it was really interesting. We really need to know what the anti-rights movement are saying in order for us to know that this is misinformation and how do we counter that. Another thing I think which is really important, because we spoke about the global gag rule and why it's important, is the fact that US is the largest funder of global health. We need to begin to increase domestic funding and maintain or expand kind of donor funding for key SAHR interventions as well as commodities. Because the thing is now, when we have the Trump administration, we're like, oh my gosh, the global gag rule, what are we going to do? But if we begin to think about particular funding streams, particular donor streams, then what may happen in this regard is that we'll begin to articulate, I suppose, shorter term, medium term, long term strategies in order to ensure that there's funding. And I think a very important one is maintaining and normalizing SAHR. We seem to make it seem as if it's like this far away thing that belongs to far away people. But all of us have sexual rights and reproductive health rights. Every single human being has that. And when we begin to think of it as a contribution to health and development outcomes, and to ensure that an essential package of sexual and reproductive health rights interventions is included in our national, regional, global strategies and mechanism, we then begin to kind of recognize a progressive realization of this right. Because I think what is happening right now is, again, we've siloed it, right? We call it trans health, SAHR. But actually, it's just rights that pertain to health, right? It's like, what about our bodies being able to function a particular way? And our body's been able to function a particular way, it needs particular resources, right? If I have an unplanned pregnancy, an unsupportable pregnancy, what can I do in order to ensure that my life is not at risk, right? Because we often think of like abortion as just this demonic thing, but abortion is life-saving. If you are someone who's not ready to have a child and you have access to an abortion, that could save your life. And we need to begin to think of the sexual and reproductive health rights as not separate rights, but as human rights that enable us to be, I like the title of the United Nations Special Rapporteur to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental well-being. When we begin to think about that, right, then we begin to think about it's not actually just about sexual and reproductive health rights, it's about human rights.
Thank you so much for that. Please, to all our audience members, you can put your questions in the Q&A box. We just kind of want to open it up to hear from you. Sort of, what are your questions? If you want to highlight, just go ahead and put them in the Q&A box. And maybe I want to circle back and to the question and the issue that you raised about confronting power. How do we confront power after so many years of being in this, let's say, unhealthy dependence on aid and a system and a structure that wasn't necessarily created for the equality of all nations and all peoples? How do we even begin to do that? That seems to me an impossible task. Where do we go? What's step one?
Yeah, I'm tired. That's the truth. And I think what needs to maybe happen is we need to think of this as a relay and have really networks that enable us to also take a break, right? Because this work is also so personal, we do tend to just keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going. And we feel guilty when we can no longer show up. And I think part of what is missing is the ability to take a break, to come back refreshed, to be inspired, by different things, and know that in the interim the fight continues. Because I think part of the guilt is that you feel that if you take a break, you kind of, you leave the work, so to say. And so the guilt then is that you then just keep giving and giving and giving, and you keep going. And so to the extent to which we want sustainable resourcing and funding, I think a lot of that has to help sustain and build our fabric, so that we can take breaks when we need them, Sarah. Because when this was happening, I looked back and I found interviews and I found articles and op-eds and all sorts of things from 2017, 2018. And I'm like, what business did I have even knowing half of this stuff? I was just like coming out of medical school, and so it shows you that, sometimes we have to look at the curriculum as well, because I knew the things that I knew because of the professors that I'd had, right? But I'm still one of how many who were in that classroom for 6 years. So we need more and more healthcare workers who understand and take very seriously this responsibility to advocate for patients. Because they are the oath takers, because they're already in this system, we have opted in to this system as healthcare workers. So I think we do have a responsibility to really do what we can with what we have to make it work. But I do know that the reason why sometimes we don't get the results that we want, that we expect, is because we are depending on the same people to be doing the hard lifting still year after year after year. And so what does sustainable movement building look like in this context then as well? Because nobody's going to throw no money at some black woman. Never mind that she's the UN Special Rapporteur. Doesn't matter. Trust me. Right? So what do we do? What do we do as a collective? What do we do as a movement when none of that matters? Right? For the things that we care about. So what does it look like? And I think that's where the space, we need to sit in that space of not knowing and not being sure of what actually follows. Because if we had to do what I've been doing as an individual for the last decade, I know that I will perish. I will perish. So how do we support each other? What does that look like? And that's the discussion around movement building and resourcing and taking things back where they should be, with women, right? With women, with people who are most impacted by these issues, because we know what changes we need. We understand the urgency of the issues, and so we know how to prioritize, and how to resource mobilize. I think that's the thing, because it's possible. You know, this deficiency mentality in global health, it's something that's engineered. When you look at the kinds of profits that networks of hospitals make in private, when you look at how much money pharmaceutical companies make, the deficiency nature of global health is manufactured. It's manufactured. And so we would have to think and turn all of that upside down. But I'm happy also not knowing and not having all of the answers. But what I do know for sure is I can't carry on business as usual. I will surely perish. There is just no way that this is normal, right? I think we've normalized a lot of things in global health that are just absolutely should not have been. You know, we come back from pandemics. We are sick from genocides. We are now dealing with an extra level of white supremacy and just delinquency that one cannot even quantify in diplomatic spaces, in the multilateral space. And so parts of me just feel like, let's leave communities alone. Let's leave people alone to live their lives, figure out their lives out. They do it with or without any promise of any aid or anything anyway, right? So maybe that's what we ought to be doing, is just leave people alone. So yeah, I'm all over, but that's part of where we are, you know, with life and things. Yeah. Sorry, no solutions, but
Oh, that's okay. You've left it to Little Honolo and Satang to give us the master solutions. What do? We have to do something. Dr. T says it's a relay. I'm not the only one who can carry this thing. At some point, I have to pass on the baton. In sort of like 2 minutes, Satang, Little Honolo, what are your thoughts? What do we do going forward?
I can go first. Yeah, I think one, just on the point about the data or the mis and disinformation that was highlighted before, I think there is also something there that we can strategically think of in terms of how we harness the digital tools. Obviously, I mean, we could have a long conversation as to the downside of AI and digital tools, and one of Dr. T's report did very well in relation to digital innovation. But I also think specifically in terms of how we, and I she'll say, I'm gonna say, she said to leave local communities alone, but to say engage with local communities. I think especially around SRHR data literacy, I think is absolutely important and vital, and very much perhaps low-hanging fruit in this conversation as well. Then the second thing I think, as folks, especially my own self, given our sort of comfort in doing research, in doing organizing, that's not necessarily radical organizing. I think we need to perhaps re-engage in critical self-reflection about the ways that we do the things that we do, right? And so really thinking about what we can also draw from other movements that are not necessarily SRHR movements, but thinking about things like mutual aid, right, as a way of putting solidarity really into action, right? Mutual aid and co-ops, which have really been great, especially in terms of addressing food appetites in certain places within the US context and beyond, as well. I think are really ways that we can really think about in terms of how we show up for each other, but also particularly when states are not doing what they're supposed to do, right? As entryway into radical community organizing. So I think part of it as well is really engaging, as was Alia highlighted, in critical self-reflection about the ways and our strategies of engaging, but perhaps borrowing from other movements as well. And yeah, I'm gonna stop here, and I'm sure they have the incredible solutions for all of us. You go ahead. We've put you on the spot now. So
I think everyone has said everything. I think for me, often I wonder if we're asking the right question. We often, for me, this question about solutions means that we want things to change, right? But it seems we're preaching to the converted. Maybe the question we should be asking is this question: whether the system wants to change. And we know what the answer to that question is. And so how do we begin to carve out space as we have in this world that is anti-us, anti-rights, anti-progress, right? And I think Dr. T is right, and I think Satang is right. It's kind of like we eat an elephant bit by bit. I know it's kind of optimistic, and I want to follow the teachings of James Baldwin, who says, I cannot be a pessimist, because to be a pessimist means I don't want to be alive. So I'm being optimistic, and I want to say we survived 4 years of Trump before, and perhaps we will come out of this differently. And I think we may come out of this more wiser. We may come out of this realizing that we need to begin to create our own funding streams and expanding that, so that we're not reliant on benevolent or not benevolent, but conditional aid, right? And yeah, I think we'll make it. That's the solution that I have. I think we'll make it.
The optimist, hope, right? Without hope, what do we have? We must move forward, right? Even if we think about the journey of coming to human rights and agreeing as nations of the world that we need this thing called human rights, so that all of us can have dignity, all of us can live in equality. The paper was just the beginning, but the struggle continues. A luta continua, right? So, I want us to also be thinking of what are some of the exemplary approaches that we could share with activists or lawyers online right now about how we do continue to create the systems we want. So as Little Honolo pointed out, sometimes the system doesn't want to change. As a lawyer, I feel like that's what laws are for. Laws are good to force the system to change in some way, shape, or form. So are there good laws or good practices out there that other jurisdictions can emulate? Satang, you talked about even Latin America being quite aspirational, and some parts of Africa, such as South Africa, being aspirational. So let's hear, on a hopeful note, what are those good things that we've seen that others can emulate?
Did you want me to go or someone else?
We just want Hope to go. Whoever's feeling hopeful, go
I,
forth.
I don't know whether I'm the best person for a hopeful tone. I don't know. Dr. C, you want to go for hope? No, I don't.
No, I was gonna go in concluding remarks, so I don't know if uh
You can conclude on a hopeful note. What do we do? What are our marching orders?
all right. All right. So let me wrap it all up for us. I think what's important is to demand reparative work from ourselves, from our allies, but also from, of course, global health as a whole, and what that means in terms of global aid. I think a lot of where this aid, it's in inverted commas, is supposed to go, it's actually going to places that are being extracted of their natural resources, of their land, their water resources. They've been left polluted from previous settler colonialism and extractive capitalistic activities currently ongoing. So it's aid, yes, in part, but actually we owe the world a lot more than what even this supposed aid is supposed to be giving. And so I think for me, reparations, 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 and what do they therefore look like as we move forward? And I think we come out of the, commemorating of the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I think in terms of hope, that gives us a framework where we can all look beyond 2030, so to say, and find ways to realign and reposition for a future of a world that is free from racism and sexism and misogyny and transphobia and ableism and classism. And what will it take, therefore, to make all of these structural issues become less and less and less of a factor? I think what we do every day, Sarah, in terms of hope, is that we do shift power every single day. We are people on this call who experience many of the challenges that we are fighting and taking on every day. But we are also very empowered people as leaders, and our leadership is right here, right now, to be felt. And so we are already doing the work, and I think it's important to also acknowledge that these spaces that we create are also very important for thought leadership, are very important for us to also recognize that we are not alone, and that we may, of course, sometimes feel that we represent entire communities with us. And sometimes you may just be representing that little you that you have to fight for every single day. And so the idea is to persist, to continue to insist, to resist, right? Because our lives do depend on it. And this is not just about survival. And I've often said that even with my tenure at the UN as a special rapporteur, it's always been around restoration of people's dignity, about moving from survival to thriving. And so that's very important as a concept for us to keep in mind as we demand reparations, that we are intentional with how, therefore, we move from survival to thriving. It's important to continue to respect and to protect the key principles of human rights, which are non-discrimination, equality, meaningful participation of rights holders, autonomy, dignity, and ultimately well-being of all individuals, and especially those who continue to live in the margins of society. And with that, I invite all of you to join this Sexual and Productive Health Rights webinar series, which will be happening monthly until June, where we'll continue to explore the different ways in which strategic litigation, communications for change, advocacy around sexual and productive health rights can bring a meaningful change in the restoration of dignity of all people, looking at different contexts around the world as we build and push past and forward against the anti-rights movement. Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you very much to all of our panelists.
Thank you so much. And maybe we'll just have one last word as well from Satang and Little Honolo. Just one quick one-liner. What's your takeaway for everyone? And then we will end the webinar.
I mean, Dr. C said it all, but I think we just need a reminder that we constantly need to remind ourselves to put social justice and the people that are most affected in the center of the fight that we do. And for researchers that are on the call, I think it is our utmost responsibility that we continue to generate, and not only generate, but strategically disseminate the much needed evidence to support global movements that are working towards the advancement of human rights standards as well. Thanks.
Sarah, you always give me such difficult things to do, but I want to leave us with the words of Audre Lorde, who wrote in 1960 in an essay. I just want to get the name correctly. The essay is called Learning from the 60s. And Audre says this, which I think I want to leave us with today. There is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. And that's it, like the struggles are interconnected. And so once we know that this is not just about people who want to access safe abortions, it's not a single issue because we don't live single issue lives. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you to our panelists. And thank you to everyone who joined us. Please continue to follow this series. Continue to visit the O'Neill Facebook page, website, Twitter as well, to keep track of every single event that will come up in this series. And we'll see you all next month to discuss the next topic on our SRHR Justice series. Thank you, everyone.